Welcome to The Plunge with Holser. Gardener Derek here today, digging in the dirt, cultivating a wonderful array of glorious flora. Beautiful, exquisite, diverse. The things of this earth bring such bounty to us all, not just for sustenance, but for inspiration, for hope, for our soul. And I'm so excited to have joining me today Laura Van Dyke, professor from the Department of English and Creative Writing at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia. Her interests are in the environmental humanities, 20th century British and Canadian literature, and the writing of the Inklings. She helps direct the Inklings Institute of Canada and is a co-editor of the Inklings and Culture, published in 2020, the first essay collection to treat all 7 Inklings-related authors. Laura's also a basketball player and coach, which, you know me, you know I love that. Genuinely, it was a delight to discuss Barfield's novel Eager Spring with Laura, and I'm grateful to you for joining us to learn more about this important work, and I'm very grateful to Laura for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. Well, today it is a pleasure to be with you, Laura Van Dyke, Trinity Western University, up in Vancouver, Canada, just a bit north of me here on the island in Washington. I was curious, first time for us to meet, and I'm wondering if you'd share a little bit of your life story, how you ended up what you're doing today, and the journey that took you there.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Derek. It's great to be here this morning. So I was born and raised in British Columbia, Canada, in a coastal town about an hour's drive from Vancouver. And I stayed local for my undergrad, so I actually went to Trinity Western University, which is where I now teach, and I studied English and theology there, and that was really where I got more into the Inklings. I took courses in the Inklings, and I'd read a bit before, mostly Lewis and Tolkien, and I'd always been a reader, especially fantasy, so I had picked up, Lord of the Rings as a teenager, as so many of us do, and nothing was ever the same again, as they say. I think it's still my desert island book, or the book I would take with me to wait out the end of the world somewhere. And I couldn't have said why I loved it so much back then, or why my friends and I got together for Entmoot every week and gave ourselves elvish names. And part of my graduate work in English literature, I suppose, was trying to find a language for the power of those kinds of stories, and stories that I think invite us into a world that's so rich, or as Barfield might say, so much more participatory than the world modernism holds out to us. I did my PhD at the University of Ottawa, and actually there the member of the Inklings that I focused the most on, though, was Charles Williams. I kind of like the weird guys. I had become very interested in the Irish poet W.B. Yeats as well, and I had sensed that there was some interesting points of connection with Williams in terms of how they treated the relationship between the material and spiritual worlds. And I think that went back to growing up. I had played the harp and spent a decade working through the Royal Conservatory program, which was pretty demanding in terms of exams every year and music theory classes. And so at a certain point, it was really starting to drain any joy I had once had in just playing music. But I did have a really great teacher. And one day she told me, we were going to take a break from the kind of technical pieces I had been struggling with, and instead she just gave me a book of very simple Irish folk songs, and I took those home and I started playing them, and suddenly harp was fun again. And I would look at the top of the page and there was lyrics attached to some of them and this name, William Butler Yeats, and I thought, don't know who that guy is, but in a kind of circuitous way, that was what led me to Yeats's poetry. And it turns out those lyrics were just poems that other people had set to these folk tunes. So I would say that was my crash course into poetry. And so right from the beginning, it was about the sound of language. It wasn't so much about eyesight, deciphering black and white squiggles on a page. It was very auditory and musical. And so Barfield actually tells a story that I find really endearing, and I can relate to it. He talks about how when he was about I think 11 or 12, he was sitting in a Latin lesson and the teacher quoted the line, Cato died at age 80. But in Latin, the phrase goes, Cato at the age of 80 walked out of life. And the boy sitting next to Barfield in the classroom said, and I imagine a little British boy accent, like, well, that's rather nice. And Barfield was very struck by that because the boy, who was actually Cecil Hardwood, who became one of his closest friends, what Cecil was pointing out was that this phrase was actually a metaphor, and it was possible to just enjoy metaphors and words for their own sake, just to take pleasure in them, to luxuriate in the sound of them. Kind of interesting, like also around this age, Barfield developed a stammer, and he talks about this quite a bit and remembers it being really terrible, very embarrassing for him. Sometimes he wouldn't just stutter, but he was totally mute and couldn't say anything at all. And I had a childhood lisp, as many kids do, I think, where I struggled with my R's and my S's. And so because of that, I've looked into this a bit, or maybe I just notice when I'm reading like an author's biography. But so many poets and writers and literary people have dealt with childhood speech issues like this, and so I have a little theory. There's no way to verify this, I suppose, but I wonder if that's what made Barfield attend more closely to language than he otherwise might have. Anyway, yeah, so I'm currently a professor at Trinity Western University, and that's where I help run the Inklings Institute of Canada. For most of my life, I did not want to be a teacher because I had 3 older sisters who were all teachers, and so I was quite adamant as the youngest, oh, I'm not just going to copy them. But I had kind of early experiences being a camp counselor and coaching basketball and tutoring, and that made me realize I really did love teaching. So that's where I've ended up, and I'm pretty thrilled to be at Trinity Western, where we have such a focus on the Inklings and a really amazing community of people who come around these authors.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's an incredibly rich environment that has been fostered there, particularly in those studies. Um,
Yeah,
I thank you.
make the drive up.
I have streamed a couple of events that
Okay.
Monica made available for me online, and one with our beloved friend Ron Dart. And yeah, I'll get up there for sure. There were a couple of other things that stood out to me as you shared your story, and thank you for your candor. One is loving the oddballs, which I can absolutely relate to. And, they always seem to be up to something that a lot of people aren't paying attention to, but it seems as though they hold on to some secrets that would benefit us all. So I really enjoy the work that you've done in that regard to cultivate and bring some of these concepts out into the more open for people. The other thing that jumped out for me is that you coached basketball. And you may not know this, but I grew up in Kentucky, which is basketball central pretty much, especially when I was growing up. And I still play the game and have coached it for many years over the course of my life. So we have a commonality there.
I have to ask you how tall you are because you can't tell, but yes, I'm 6 feet tall.
Okay, wonderful. I am a mere 6'3".
Okay,
I
but they
play
still let you play.
yeah. I play the wing. Back in the day, not to brag, but I could get up there and throw it down. So yeah, it's such a fun sport.
Go in the championship game. Magafan into the corner for Holzer. Quickly they go to Grant. No shock to see him get an early touch, but it's Holzer who gets it started from 3. They didn't have...
I've only been to Kentucky once, just for the Derby, but it definitely worked its magic on me.
Yeah, it's a charming place, and the Derby is like no other event. The whole city comes out and shuts down for a week.
Just for, 2 minutes, 2-minute race, and then you
Yes,
go home.
yes. Well, it's always encouraging for me to also meet a Canadian who loves basketball because it was a Canadian who invented it, doing Dr. Naismith proud. As we move into talking about Owen, how did you first encounter him and what was your first impression?
Yeah, so I had known a little bit about Barfield just from having read so much Lewis, but it was actually in a class on the Inklings taught by Stephen Dunning, who I know you've had on the channel. And that was when I first really made my way through a full Barfield text. Actually, 2. Stephen was way too ambitious and had us read both Worlds Apart and Saving the Appearances. And this was like in the first week of the course.
That sounds right from my
Yeah,
encounter with Stephen.
we were all very, very confused and thought, who is this? What is this guy talking about? But I was also very intrigued. There was something there, like about his account of human consciousness that felt very true to my experience of the world. So I actually picked up Poetic Diction, his 28 text, and that was the one actually that really grabbed me. I remember just being floored at the idea that he was able to read the history of humanity in language, that language was the fossil record for him, and he was this kind of archaeologist bringing up the history of our species. So it was really that idea that language discloses truth to us that lit me up and made me want to keep learning from this guy. And I still think that that's among Barfield's greatest insights. Of course, in the academy today, we don't really have philology anymore as a discipline, but essentially Barfield begins his writing career as a philologist, but his work in language is so much more interdisciplinary than that. He's using philology to do history and to think philosophically, to analyze literature with a bit of anthropology and theology and probably a few more things thrown in for good measure. He has his argument in poetic diction, and I really think it's very convincing. It's that the story language tells is embedded in our words. It's embedded in the meaning of our words. And the example he gives first, which is always quoted, so others have probably talked about this already in your series, but it's that the way wind and spirit and breath and air, they all meant the same thing in all of these early languages. So they weren't separate words the way we have now in English. So in early forms of Greek, it's pneuma, in Latin, it's spiritus, in Hebrew, it's ruach. And so Barfield says, even just 2,000 years ago, which really isn't that long, when the Gospel of John was being written, we read in chapter 3, and I don't have my text with me, but that's the scene where Jesus talks to Nicodemus about being born again.
Right.
It's that verse where Jesus says, like, I tell you, no one can enter the kingdom of God unless they're born of the Spirit. Spirit gives birth to spirit. The wind blows where it pleases, etc., etc. And so in Greek, when you read it, the word is just pneuma, 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 pneuma over again, right? Pneuma gives birth to pneuma. Pneuma blows where it pleases. And Barfield saw that and thought that is hard evidence that even the Greeks during that time saw a unity between the inner and the outer worlds that we just no longer see. So when they felt wind blowing on them, they wouldn't have separated that from spirit. And when they breathed in air, they wouldn't have felt, like they would have felt they were participating in the external spirit world. And so now that we've separated wind from spirit, so that wind is the outside thing and spirit is the inner thing, this verse shows that humans once had a more integrated consciousness that enabled the inner life of humans to have some of that meaningfulness that comes when we think now of all that metaphysical stuff, right? The stuff that's like out there, up there. And so Barfield goes on in Poetic Diction to explain that this is the case everywhere we look. Studying the etymology of any word or phrase shows us the same shift in consciousness. So everyday words tell us a story. Like, so for example, we might say reading Barfield allows us to discover new ideas. The word discover tells a story. In Latin, it meant to bury or to cover up. So to kind of dig out or root out. So it's a very embodied word. It's very active and it has a lot of energy to it. And if we're talking about discovering Barfield's ideas, we're talking about understanding Barfield, and so we can think about the word understand, this old Germanic word for standing beneath something. And often in a literature class, we talk about how when we're reading a book, we stand underneath it. We submit ourselves to its authority. We have the humility to stand under the teaching of someone. And humility itself, of course, shares a root with human, and it comes from that Latin word humus that means of the earth. So the idea that the human comes from the earth, or as Ash Wednesday just reminded us last week, we come from dust and to dust we will return. So those are all metaphors, but they're just everyday language stuff, kind of figurative language. And Barfield says the further you go back in history, the more you'll find that language is figurative or poetic as opposed to literal or prosaic. And so poetry is special because it has almost this magic power. It summons us back into that kind of consciousness. When we read poetry, Barfield says, we feel, we experience in our sensations a kind of change because poetry works through this kind of elusive quality. It's figurative and open-ended and ambiguous, and it invites us into a reality where words operate differently than they do in that prosaic world. I was just thinking, I'm in a book club right now and we're reading Charles Taylor's book, Cosmic Connections. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it just struck me that he makes precisely the same argument, even though he's not quoting Barfield at all. So Taylor argues in this giant tome that in the modern disenchanted world, one route back to recovering a participatory world is poetry, because it makes us look at that phenomenal world with different eyes. So Barfield isn't the only one to argue this, but I think maybe he said it first, and maybe he said it in really clear terms that I think I was able to kind of, okay, yeah, and this is part of why I want to study literature, kind of open that up for me.
That's great. Man, that's helpful. And I think about a conversation that I just had with Michael DeFucia as part of this series, and my own experience with poetry, with transcendent art. And I know we're talking specifically about language, but there is something, and this might connect to Barfield's conception with respect to symbolism and meaning. And as you use the word discover, connected to something that might be covered, as it were. So many of these things in our lifetimes and before have been separated. So I'm not exactly sure the word I'm looking for, which is ironic for this conversation, but that
Barfield
poet,
would know the word, but yeah, we don't.
yeah, but that poetry reintegrates, perhaps more than any other expression, the things that Barfield was drawing us to pay attention to. Would that be correct?
Yeah, and it occurs to me that the word he often uses is undifferentiated.
Yeah.
So maybe that's what you were thinking. I feel like Barfield is not always very good at coming up with examples or analogies, but he does make one analogy that I think is useful here. He uses this example of like a modern walking around the world with a camera. And he says this gets at how perception works for us now. So if we walk around the world like we have a camera and the lens is the thing that is in between us and the phenomenal world, the representations, we feel very detached from what we're constantly like photographing. But he says we're not cameras. We participate so much more intimately in what we're seeing. He says we're more like a harp, at least in original participation. We're more like a lyre and the wind blows through us. And it's our job to attune ourselves to the world's wind so that nature is like sounding through us, he says. And I think he's kind of quoting Shelley's poem, Ode to the West Wind here. And he talks about how this is why ancient epics always invoke the muse to sing through them. But there's a kind of resonance there. Not that word undifferentiated is probably what he's unpacking there as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect. Today we're going to talk about a novel of his, Eager Spring. But before that, I was just curious if you had any thoughts to describe Barfield's influence in the Inklings development, but also longer standing influence on wider Western society.
Yeah, so his influence in terms of the Inklings would have been the greatest on Lewis, for sure. Lewis was the strongest connection he had to the group. And you always get the sense from Lewis's letters that he really admired Barfield very deeply. He calls him, of course, the wisest and the best of his unofficial teachers. He says he towers above us all. And he was just constant in his affection for him. There was a real love there. That being said, Lewis couldn't go along with Barfield's anthroposophy, but it didn't seem to diminish his respect for Barfield. In one letter, he writes about how he has a few friends who follow what he calls the doctrines of Rudolf Steiner. And he says those doctrines are erroneous, and that he's frequently engaged in controversy with his friends on the subject. But he says, that being the case, I've never detected even a shred of intellectual or ethical diminishment as a result of their beliefs. And I kind of love that, right? That ability to have mutual respect in spite of difference. I think that's something we could all use a lot more of today.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, so Barfield and Lewis are, in a way, a beautiful model of that. I think in terms of Tolkien, yeah, Barfield had some influence on Tolkien, which isn't surprising given that Tolkien was a philologist. Tolkien apparently told Lewis once that he was never able to lecture on certain topics after he'd read Poetic Diction without recalling some of Barfield's ideas about ancient semantic unity that, he said, modified my whole outlook on language. And that would force him to kind of check what he was about to say in a lecture. In terms of Charles Williams, I don't think Barfield had any influence whatsoever on Williams. But it's interesting to me that Williams is the one who probably has the most in common with Barfield out of all the main four. Barfield told Humphrey Carpenter once that he may have found some common philosophical or theological ground with Williams if they had ever had the chance to talk alone and at length, but unfortunately Williams died pretty young and they just never got the chance. But it's pretty clear from Barfield's work that he later read quite a bit of Williams, actually, and incorporates some references in a few of his books, including Eager Spring, so we'll get to that. But yeah, Stephen Dunning has written about this in detail because he interviewed Barfield in the summer of 1986. Barfield told him the same story he'd related to Carpenter, which is such a funny story about how Barfield and Williams first met. Apparently, Williams just burst into the room, as he did, without knowing anything about Barfield, or that he was a disciple of Steiner. And so he burst into the room and announced, "I've just been talking to somebody who accused me of being an anthroposophist." Yeah, I would say that Barfield seems to be intrigued by a few of Williams's key ideas, like coherence. And so, like I said, he mentions him, I think, in Saving the Appearance, in Unancestral Voice, and he definitely read Descent of the Dove, which is probably the work of theology Williams is most known for today in a lot of circles. I think to touch on the second part of your question, asking about the influence of Barfield on the wider society, it makes me think of an argument that Barfield's biographer, Simon Blaxland Delange, has made, where he says that a quality which the other Inklings did not by and large share with Barfield was his passionate concern, not merely with visionary ideas, but with their implementation. And Barfield himself commented once that he didn't think any of the Inklings had any real interest in society as a whole. He says, "Lewis never read a single newspaper or anything of that sort." He says, "I don't think Tolkien did." He says, "Charles Williams, I'm not sure. He was more wide awake to the world than the other two." But he says, "Oh, but I didn't know him very well." And I don't know how fair that is, given that the other Inklings did impact the world in such real ways, although of course they were primarily artists. So they impacted the world through their imaginative writing. And so, yeah, they weren't social activists, but I don't think that means they didn't have an interest in society, or that, for instance, Lewis, I don't think in an ideal world he would have chosen to spend his time doing those BBC talks that involved him taking the train to London, but he felt it mattered to his society living in wartime Britain. So Barfield can sometimes be dismissive of Lewis's public work as a lay theologian because he had so little interest in that kind of apologetics or devotional work. But I think probably from our point of view, that was work worth doing, and I don't think we would be alone in feeling that way. So I also think about how, with the benefit of hindsight, we know now that Tolkien has had an enormous influence on the development of the post-war modern environmental movement. And more Tolkien scholarship is taking this up and seeing Lord of the Rings as a text that really ushered in a new ecological awakening.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the extent to which Barfield himself has impacted the wider world in the way he wanted is still uncertain. I think about a story that my good friend Matthew Steam told. He's the editor-in-chief of Radix magazine, and he recently interviewed Barfield's grandson, Owen Barfield, who I know you've recently spoken to as well.
Yes.
And Owen Barfield the younger tells a story about helping his grandfather pack up some of the things in his house as he was preparing to move. And he recalls Barfield sat down at one point and kind of sighed and said, "It will be 50 years before my work is understood." And so this was in the mid-80s, 1985, which meant he was speaking about the time we're in right now. And I love that story, and I suspect that Barfield was probably right about his own legacy, that it would take a while. And it's interesting to me that, although he thought his work would find an audience eventually, he was pretty skeptical that this audience would be primarily academic. So he gave a lecture in 1977, I believe, where he suggested that a revived relationship to spirituality and to nature, that it needed to happen soon if our civilization was going to survive. But he said, quote, "It would not be in the academic world where this breakthrough would occur." And he said that because he was pretty dismayed at the state of academia. Even back then, he felt that there was no unity of knowledge in the university, but just an increasing specialization that resulted in individual academics knowing what he called more and more about less and less, which is kind of burned on my brain. It's a great but a disquieting line for those of us working in the academy, in what some people have taken today to calling the multiversity, where it really is difficult to find a unity of knowledge, especially outside of liberal arts colleges. So I guess part of me wonders if that was part of why he turned towards writing fiction. Not that he stopped lecturing or writing philosophical works, but I wonder if he was perhaps imitating the path taken by Lewis and the other Inklings. So that's part of my interest in Eager Spring. For those of you who don't know, Eager Spring is the last work of fiction Barfield wrote before he died in 1997, and he was 99 years old. So that's why we call him the first and the last Inkling. And that means it's the work of his mature imagination, and it represents the culmination of much of his thinking about human history, the evolution of consciousness, anthroposophy, language, and the role of imaginative creation and human meaning making. That it's his last novel also means it's the last creative work to come out of the Inklings. So I have a special interest in it for that reason alone. And Derek, as you know, The Silver Trumpet was the first published work of fiction to come from the Inklings. So Barfield really bookends 70 years of output coming from this remarkable literary group.
Amazing. Remarkable longevity and remarkable clarity, even though perhaps, as you described your first encounter in Professor Dunning's class as being somewhat disorienting, I think as everyone on this series has echoed, which I'm sure you would as well, that the rereading of these texts is where the true revelation begins to affect us. And in particular, you mentioned Tolkien's work with Lord of the Rings and his portrayal of the land, of nature, of course the Ents, the way in which they're encountered by the forces of Mordor, the orcs, the brutality, the disrespect, the disregard for God's created order to use it to their ends was certainly, I would imagine, not having been there, I would imagine for those who came of age in the late 60s and the early 70s would have left a deep impression with respect to moving us into a time of greater care for our environment. And I'm curious, since Eager Spring is, as you pointed out, is connecting to this as we transition into Barfield's work. I've not read it still. I've got a lot of Barfield to read.
I can imagine.
But you had mentioned to me as we corresponded leading up to this conversation that it's one story with two tales, and I'm curious if you could explain what that means.
Yeah, so this is a novel, or technically maybe a novella, a short novel, that's actually split into two parts. It's called Part 1 and Part 2. Basically, so Part 1 is made up of 10 chapters, and it tells the story of a woman named Vi, or Virginia, and her marriage to a man named Leonard, or Leo. And Part 2 is a single chapter, but a very long chapter, and it's about totally different characters. The protagonist is a woman named Maria, and it's set hundreds of years earlier, and it's in the form of a fairy tale that Vi actually tells as she lies dying. Sorry if that's a spoiler.
Okay.
So when Eager Spring opens, we read about how Vi is a young grad student in English literature, and she's completely preoccupied by figuring out the connection between myth, allegory, and courtly love. So she has a lot of C.S. Lewis in her, and Barfield is clearly drawing on the allegory of love in places. And the book is on one level just a work of academic fiction where ideas and conversations about ideas are central. But on another level, it's a marriage story similar to That Hideous Strength, where Barfield treats the marriage between Vi and Leonard with a high degree of psychological insight. So after Vi marries Leo, who is a grad student as well, and then he becomes a professor of archaeology, their relationship becomes increasingly marked by disconnection and a resulting lack of emotional and maybe spiritual intimacy. In particular, Vi struggles to communicate with him her thoughts about the evolution of consciousness, which she's recently come to ascribe to. And she thinks in one scene about what's gone wrong in the modern world and how in her relationship with Leo, he transitioned from a roommate to a husband with very little fuss. And she says, that's so different than the marriages I read about, the marriage is idealized in the courtly love tradition. And as she's thinking this, the narrator intrudes and tells us that a line from one of Charles Williams's poems slid into her mind, and she actually quotes the poem. So thinking about Charles Williams, strangely, so it's a very intertextual novel. Thinking about this Williams poem opens her up to the possibility that all those chivalric romances of the medieval age, the ones that Lewis too wrote about, with their exaltation of the body of the lover, are somehow linked to a larger affirmation of the whole material world. And so she starts a journey and begins to kind of preoccupy herself with the late 20th century environmental movement and England's deforestation. At the beginning of the story, she says, I only know a little bit about what she calls the earth and its doings. But eventually she joins an ecological conservation group called the Earth Lovers. She joins a committee, even though she's very skeptical about the group's aims, and she's very frustrated that they don't actually do much. And because of her work with allegory and courtly love, she starts seeing that there's a connection between our bodies and the natural world. She says our bodies are part of the phenomenal world, and so losing a kind of eros for each other's bodies in a relationship is tied to losing our participatory relationship with nature. And so she becomes very disillusioned with the environmentalists she knows. She says they don't really have an eros for the earth. But nevertheless, she joins them in a risky plan to, this is where the novel becomes this kind of adventure novel. They're trying to disrupt the transfer of a shipment of crates that contains these dangerous biocides, toxic chemicals that these very sinister corporations are shipping off to the third world. And a little bit gets on Vi's clothing and skin, and they seemingly kill her. So as her body is lying dying, though, she's able to kind of birth a story. Conte, this French word for fairy tale. And the second part of Eager Spring is actually Leo reading the fairy tale as Vi lies dying on the bed next to him. And the point of view shifts to him. So incidentally, there's something kind of George MacDonald-esque about this short tale. And at the end of his life, Barfield cited MacDonald as the writer who, after Steiner, of course, had the most long-standing influence on him.
Oh, that makes me so happy.
Yeah. So the fairy tale that she tells, and we're kind of like Leo, we're reading it along with him. It features three sisters, of course, as every good fairy tale should, and they come upon a traveling troubadour named Paolo, who is a very Charles Williams-esque troubadour who quotes Dante all the time, and he's finding his Beatrice in the youngest of the three sisters, Maria, and she's really the protagonist of this tale. So both Vi's story and then Maria's story are about romantic love, and finding through romantic love a greater awareness of their participation in reality. And I think Vi does achieve, by the end, what Barfield calls final participation. That stage, he says, in Saving the Appearances, that, quote, we had all better be moving in the direction of. But this stage can only happen through the active imagination, and in particular, an imagination that's been somehow animated or enlivened by love. It's important, I think, that alongside her environmental activism, Vi chooses to use her poetic imagination to write a fairy tale. And then, of course, on a meta level, this is Barfield as an old man writing a fairy tale through her. And like we said, that's the last creative act he did as an old man nearing the end of his life. So I just love that Barfield, like his fellow Inklings, is so certain this is the way to make meaning in the world.
Very good. Thank you. Well, and I'm curious if you have any thought. If not, we can just disregard it. But I'm just curious as to how in our current situation of relative abundance, at least with respect to material things, food, in our part of the world, I'm limiting it to our experience, that the overindulgence of what would be sensual experiences is actually an element of the hurdle that we still have to cross to return to the purest expression, as I'm sure he is getting at in his work. Does anything there make any sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're asking. I wonder if, like, what Barfield is talking about in terms of the courtly love tradition, I'm not sure I would call it sensuous in that kind of indulgent way. It really is, like Williams called it, the doctrine of romantic love. And in a way, there's an austerity to it, where it's much more about an eros that recognizes the other is a real human being made in the image of a god. And so sometimes the courtly love tradition is critiqued as putting the lover on a kind of pedestal and almost divinizing them. Williams and Barfield were totally comfortable with that, though. So it's that something happens to the lover where the self recedes, and they're able to recognize the radical otherness and love something that's not the self. And so I think what we see often in our culture, as you were speaking to this, is much more of a kind of portrayal of sexuality that is very ego-driven and about gratifying the ego. And so the courtly love poets and people like Dante, that would have been just bizarre to them. That's not at all what they're talking about. So when Dante is following Beatrice like through all the layers of hell and then purgatory and heaven, Williams took that as one of the most profound statements you could make about what another human being could do for you in your journey towards God, and how this is part of what we're here to do for each other, help each other on our spiritual journeys, as opposed to use each other. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. It does. And it reinforces for me that these are people that I'm inclined to agree with. My next question with respect to Eager Spring is it explores, as I think all of Barfield's work, my limited knowledge, it explores a relationship between scientific materialism and a more holistic spiritual view of nature. I'm curious if the characters embody these conflicting worldviews and if the novel reconciles them in any way.
Yeah, that's a great question. So Vi's embrace of that more spiritual view of nature, it comes through her friendship, I'd say, with two main characters in this story. Their names are Henry Coppard and John Herapath. So Henry is an environmentalist. He's trying to reforest the land around Eager Spring. And John is an anthroposophist. John is one of her husband's colleagues at the college, and he's an art history professor, and he's really the mouthpiece in the novel for Rudolf Steiner's ideas, because there's always got to be one. So in conversations with him, Vi comes to a lot more clarity about the relationship between human consciousness and the physical environment. And so she's very, very preoccupied with prehistory and the question of what the earliest humans were like. And so John, the anthroposophist character, there's long passages where they're having just conversations, because this is often what a Barfield novel is like. You're just reading dialogue, and he forgets about plot for a while. But John helps her to see that since Paleolithic humans lived on the earth, the line of connection between human consciousness and the natural world has changed direction, he says. So Vi comes to see in this very Barfieldian way that the traffic used to come from nature to mind, and now it goes from the conscious mind into nature. So in other words, spirit first generated matter, but in order for the human to be a free autonomous being, spirit had to kind of slowly retreat from the natural world. And Vi comes to see that it became our task then in modernity to give nature back the spiritual life that we had once been given. So she sees the Iron Age as the pivotal point where this change in direction, this hinge moment occurred. And she uses the analogy, which I think is actually one of Barfield's more concrete metaphors, of a sponge. She says spirit was drying out of words and images, and in consequence to that was beginning to be driven out of the world of things, this kind of denaturing of nature that had begun with the scientific revolution. So there's so much to reality we can no longer access, she says, because the sponge has somehow, there's no water left in it. We have to put the water back. And again, Barfield's big idea that he articulated first in poetic diction and then returned to just over and over again for 80 years is that language, even down to individual words, language is better than fossils at telling us the story of our species' history. So we discover by studying words that we used to think differently, see differently. And embedded in those words is a memory, a kind of ancestral memory perhaps, of the way we used to be in the world. So to your question of whether or not the novel reconciles these different worldviews, I would say no, because this is a very open-ended story. I think at the end we don't know what's going to happen to any of these characters. We don't even know if Vi is going to survive. But at the end we're really invited to kind of co-create an ending along with Barfield and the characters, really. So Vi tells the story and Maria is who the story's about. Both of them seem to probably die at the end, and Leo is left holding the manuscript. And on the last page, the narrator shifts the point of view, and we're told Leo did not know that he had indeed started for the first time in his life to think, and he had just embarked on a journey that was going to take him a very long way. So I think Barfield's suggestion here is that reading this fairy tale is going to send his readers too, like Leo, off on a journey, hopefully one that takes them a long way.
Beautiful. Wow, I've got a lot to read.
The good news is it's pretty short, Derek.
Oh, very good. I can handle that. Thank you for doing this, Laura. This is a lot of fun. It's just a joy to make this connection. I'm learning as we go. My next question has to do with his concern with the evolution of consciousness. I don't know if concern's the right word again. I'm so cognizant of language when I'm discussing Barfield. It like
I
trips me
hear
up
you.
in my head.
Yeah.
Is that right? I don't know. Where did that word come from? Anyway, but with respect to evolution of consciousness and the role of language in shaping reality, does Eager Spring connect to that? Are there moments where language itself is displayed as a transformative force in the story?
Yeah, so maybe I'll speak to the evolution of consciousness first. Like I mentioned, there is a character in the text who's an anthroposophist, and he gives a lot of speeches. And these are the didactic sections of the story, and probably won't be of interest to some readers, although I think other readers might actually appreciate how clear and direct Barfield makes his theory of the evolution of consciousness sound here. So Vi is learning right along with us, the reader, about the way we've evolved from original participation through to the modern mind. And she learns that we once participated in nature, like I said, where our language and our myths were kind of drawn from the life of nature like water from a sponge. But as modernity developed, the sponge was left dry and falling to pieces, she says. So that now, if we have any chance of moving towards what Barfield calls final participation, we have to give back what we got from nature. We have to replenish that sponge. The other way around this time. And so Barfield is so certain that spirit is what created the human species. We didn't evolve from matter, as in the Darwinian story. He's adamant about this. He says that's just nonsense. Instead, he says it's spirit that first generated matter. We lived and moved within spirit for a long time, but eventually that spirit life retreated from the natural world so that we could keep developing, so that we could become free and autonomous. But again, in final participation, we have to give back to the earth that spiritual life that we've been given. And so that's where he touches on the second part of your question, where you're asking if language becomes a transformative force. And I think there the scene that comes to my mind is when Vi first reads Steiner. And so her friend, the anthroposophist, gives her his lecture on Michaelmas. And the narrator tells us that Vi did more than just read it. She actually meditates on it. And she enters almost a trance, and by engaging with it to such a sustained degree, images start flooding into her mind, and those images prompt a revelation. Some of the images, like she sees a figure of a dragon, she sees iron falling from the sky as a meteor, they end up being what she writes about in her fairy tale. So it was kind of interesting to me that, like John, this Steinerian figure in the text, he's not actually an English professor, although Vi says English is where she feels most of an affinity, but he's an art historian. And then the most transformative moment in the text for Vi is not when she reads per se, but it's when she goes to Italy and she sees a painting. She goes to a church and she sees a painting of the risen Christ. And it's a fresco that she stands in front of, just staring at for a long time. And she actually enters that same meditative trance that the Michaelmas lecture had given her. And it's a strange scene because the figure of Christ almost comes alive and speaks to her. Or in any case, she feels a call coming from it. And Christ basically tells her, you must live differently now. And I think Barfield is probably making an allusion here to Rilke's poem about hearing from the bust of Apollo, you must change your life. This line that Mary Oliver has picked up so beautifully in her poetry. But heeding this call to live differently makes Vi turn to that environmental activism that I was referring to earlier. And it seems to be what leads her to her sacrificial death, where she, like Christ, lays down her life. But in terms of that transformation that you're asking about, I think that comes through language when she actually writes down her tale, which is her vision of what has happened in the past and what needs to happen in the future. And this tale really does come from her imagination. It comes from those images that she's synthesizing together and creatively kind of filling the gaps in. And Barfield has this line where he defines imagination as thinking, but just with a bit of will thrown into it. Again, I think it's open-ended as to whether her words will affect transformation in the broader world. Barfield really leaves it with us, and I think you always have that with his fiction, that he wants to maintain the freedom of his reader. So he's always interested in being very invitational when it comes to having us come alongside him in his questions. And it's this very kind of biblical, come, let us reason together. Because Barfield has a lot of respect for our intelligence. I sometimes want to say to him, you have a bit too much, Owen. I could use a helpful analogy right about now, but he won't do it.
Yeah.
He thinks
Like
we're
like
so smart.
yeah, like the basketball coach. One more set of lines. Tell us what to do. Interesting. That's really actually quite respectable in my estimation that he holds that posture and maintains it, given how clearly passionate he was about his ideas. Okay, Eager Spring again. What is the central conflict, and how does its resolution, or lack thereof, reflect Barfield's view of human progress and consciousness?
Yeah, I struggle with this because for such a short novel, there's a lot of conflicts and there isn't a single linear plot. So maybe I'll cheat a bit and give you two. Maybe to my mind, the central conflict has to do with the ecological concerns of the whole story, though, because this is an eco novella. So in terms of environmental concerns, in his essay, Goethe and Evolution, Barfield says that stand now on the threshold either of a great disaster or else of a first step towards a third phase, by which he means final participation. And because this disaster is ecological, at least it's manifested ecologically, final participation, he says, it has to involve some kind of reunion with nature. But this time we have to maintain our autonomy, like our self-awareness, so that we're not just undifferentiated the way we were in original participation. Back when nature had given us the life and the meaning and the myth and the poetry, it's now our turn to give those things back to her, to give her spirit, so that nature isn't just inert matter, which is what the modern scientific imagination resulted in. In another essay, I think it's called The Nature of Meaning, there's one of his rare examples of humor. He makes a kind of lawyer joke. And I think you know he practiced law for most of his working life. Maybe that's something you have in common with Barfield.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And he remarks that serious consequences are likely to ensue unless, as we say in my profession, in due course some arrangement is come to, which is satisfactory to both parties, meaning both nature and humans, that we have to kind of come to some kind of arrangement. But we have no lawyer to make this happen. We have to just do it ourselves. So there's not going to be any progress unless enough people join together in working towards this. And it's some kind of tension in Barfield that I'll admit I don't quite understand. He doesn't seem to think that on an individual level we're ever going to get to final participation. It needs to be a critical mass. So this is where Barfield is often incisive, because he gets into, well, how is this going to happen? How are people going to unite together and be on the same page? And that's where I think the second conflict of the novel comes into play, because this is a story about marriage, like I said, arguably the most intimate of these relationships. And he had already done a marriage novel with English People, which is his long unfinished novel from the 1920s that's still unpublished. But one level of this text is really about Vi and Leo's marriage, and how they don't seem to connect after Vi starts getting into all of these Barfieldian ideas. And some of this, I think, is quite autobiographical. I think Barfield writes himself into Vi at moments. So when the story opens, Vi and Leo are grad students, and Vi is obsessed with these questions about prehistory. Leo, her husband, is an archaeologist, and he's totally stuck in modern scientific thinking. He really has no interest in the questions Vi is asking. But to Vi, like, these questions are so important. They dominate all of her mental space. And she just wants an answer to why earlier humans had a connection with nature that we no longer have. And she becomes certain that since the Stone Age, the line of connection between human consciousness and the natural world has changed direction, like we were saying earlier with that example of the sponge. So in order for us to recover some kind of relationship with the earth, she says, we have to give it back some of that spiritual life with which we had once been endowed. And the fact that Leo can't understand how important this all is to Vi is the cause of this increasing strain in their marriage. And that conflict doesn't really resolve in the novel, but by the end he does sit down and he reads her fairy tale, and he has this moment of realization. He says, this is who my wife is? It's this moment of epiphany where there's a recognition of how she had written her deepest self into the story. And so I think I said that the reader doesn't get a lot of resolution in this novel, but I think Barfield is pointing towards the possibility of a forward trajectory in the future. And this is really mirrored in his whole approach to writing. And it explains why he continued to lecture and to write, as we were saying, even though he could have retired, and had a peaceful retirement. But he had such a strong conviction that he had something worth saying, something that people needed to hear if things were going to get better. And so I see him as prophetic in that sense. Like, he's a writer prophet who turns to language when he's trying to communicate his take on truth.
That's great. Well, the thing that stood out to me of everything you said, and maybe this is revealing of my narcissism, but with respect to Barfield's comment as an attorney and the way that they talk in our profession with that mutual satisfaction to both parties someday. It's interesting that in the New Testament, the word advocate is used for the Spirit at several points with respect to the Spirit advocating with the Father for us, and of course Jesus himself as an advocate. And so perhaps we do have a representation after all, because Abraham Lincoln said it is of course Lincoln probably said a lot of things, and a lot of things we quote him as saying he didn't say, but this is how I learned it, that he who represents himself has a fool for a client. And so it is when the Spirit is empowered and recognized and embraced and restored that perhaps that negotiation will actually come to its full fruition.
I love that. I would never have thought that way, so there you go. You have a lot in common with Barfield, and you were kind of tracking with him there, and I'll never be able to read that the same way.
Yeah, it's like anything else, right? The domain in which we've spent so much time lends itself to insight. But it also makes me think of your comment about the multiversity and no longer the university. That's we don't have time for that, but boy, that is a conversation I would love to explore in the future with respect to the next century of higher education, what that might portend for us all. Okay, Eager Spring, just a couple more questions. How would you say Barfield's symbolism and metaphor use reinforces his philosophical views in the narrative? Does he use that to great effect, or not at all?
Yeah, I think there's a few symbols that are quite interesting in this text. And to my mind, the most powerful one is the spring itself. And we haven't really talked about the title, but Eager Spring is it's a literal spring that Vi and Leo go to. But it's also a wellspring of spiritual life, and it's a representation in the text of the way the natural world has become, in our time, so vulnerable to human technological power, because the spring actually dries up in the text, so kind of like that sponge. And in the story, this is a spring in Sussex Downs that Vi and Leo stumble across, but in real life, it came out of Barfield's visit to Gilham Spring, which is also in Sussex, and it's a real place near the village of Forest Row where he eventually settled, close to where his friend Josephine Spence lived, and she was actually the illustrator for this book. So I think that's all kind of some context for why Eager Spring resonated with Barfield. But in terms of his characters, when Vi and Leo first visit it, it's totally dried up. But their friend Henry, who I mentioned was the kind of environmentalist in the text, he's busy kind of planting acorns so that England gets reforested, especially around the spring, and eventually the spring flows again. And you think, okay, great, everything's fixed. This is going to be a happy novel. But what quickly happens is the characters learn there's a kind of poison in the pesticides that the farmers are using, and it's contaminating Eager Spring. So it's almost worse than when it was dried up. And that's the pesticide it's being engineered in England, but it's been transported to unsuspecting third world countries. And this, of course, is what was really happening, and Barfield was concerned about this. And so, as I mentioned, when Vi tries to stop the shipment of this pesticide from leaving the country, some of it gets on her skin and she becomes very ill. And as she's lying sick, probably going to die, that's when she writes that fairy tale. And the shape that the forces of evil take in the fairy tale is a kind of shadowy force, a satanic force really, that comes out of her image of these huge systemic structures that are now part of the global technocracy. And they find their energy in this very capitalist idea of perpetual growth. And it's quite clear in the story that the way this evil is manifested in the late 20th century context that Barfield is writing in is often through environmental destruction. The character Henry calls it one huge machine, and this machine just needs to be fed more and more and more. The machine is the new sponge, and we keep putting all of our imagination and all our energy and our power into that global machine instead of into nature. And so the other important symbol, I think, is actually iron, even though I know that sounds strange. And iron is connected to that machine. But Henry, the environmentalist character, he teaches Vi that the reason the forests of England were first cut down was because of the demand for wood that began with the Iron Age. And it continues into our own world with our ever-increasing demands for lumber. So Henry actually, as he's reforesting the land around Eager Spring, he uses an iron rod to make holes in the ground to plant his acorns in. And he's trying to use iron in that kind of resonant way. And then when Vi falls ill, the doctors can't really figure out what's wrong with her other than that her blood has been drained of its iron. So the pesticides that got onto her are mysterious, but as she's thinking about her illness, she remembers it was the Iron Age that led to this all. And then she tells a fairy tale that continues along this line, because the story of Maria and her two sisters is set at a time just when the iron smelting industry is ramping up. And the family discovers that the land upon which they've been farming for generations is rich in iron ore. And after their father dies and can't protect them any longer, this very sinister figure named Godfrey turns up, and he tries to push them off their land so that he can expand an iron smelting factory. He tells Maria that the way forward is to accept that iron is the secret of the future of the world. He says it's an iron world man wants, not one of useless trees and pretty flowers. So yeah, we know he's a bad guy. Actually, he's really bad. Maria soon learns that Godfrey's actually basically Satan, a kind of representation of the forces of evil and greed and progress. And just a warning, this is where things get really weird. But you said that you liked the weird guys, so maybe it's a good weird. Yeah, so the characters, they realize they have to kill Godfrey, but he's proven he's basically immortal. So the village doctor, Dr. Gropewell, tells them that a meteorite has landed nearby, and it contains iron from heaven. And iron from heaven has different virtues that iron from earth lacks. So they forge that iron into a dagger, and Maria's troubadour stabs Godfrey with that dagger, and it doesn't really kill him, but his body disintegrates, and there's a crack of thunder and a flash of lightning, and Godfrey actually disappears in a cloud of smoke that takes the shape of a great dragon. So going back to Vi's earlier dreams. So with all that to say, like, Barfield is clearly getting the reader to see there's a connection between the iron in our blood and the iron outside of our bodies. The iron that makes up the metals in the earth and the substance of the stars and the meteorites and the planets, right, in our galaxy. And so this is a metaphor for him of the way inside and outside are made up of the same stuff. We're as much nature as anything else. And so John Herpath, the anthroposophist, he tells Vi, we have to stop imagining that our mind is somehow only in our brain. And we have to start seeing our mind as part of the natural world, as something that participates in this larger cosmic web. In one of his works, I think it's On Ancestral Voice, he has this phrase, he talks about a mind-saturated cosmos. And that's really what Barfield wants us to come away from his texts sensing, that we really do live in a mind-saturated environment. Yeah, so I think those are the two main symbols, I think, that come up when you read both parts of this text. And they probably do work towards the same experience that Barfield is hoping that we'll get from his fiction.
That sounds kind of fun. Like, dabbling with a variety of genres in one story. Well, my last question is, how does Eager Spring compare with his other works? And in what ways does it serve as an extension of his philosophical ideas? And are there any ways in which it stands alone as a unique literary work?
Yeah, great question. I think there's lots of connections with previous works, but it does end up applying some of his philosophical ideas into a fictional story in a way that I don't think he had ever really done, not to this extent. So I do see it as a unique novel. And like I said, I think of all of his creative writing, it's the most likely to find an audience with contemporary readers. So maybe the first thing I'd say is that Eager Spring, we talked about it being a marriage novel. Vi and Leo are worlds apart, which is the title of one of his texts. And Barfield, I think, knew what it was like to feel huge gaps between himself and the people in his life. And you get the sense in his writing that this was a source of real grief for him at times. In his biography of Barfield, if Delange is to be believed, and I know there's some issues with reliability, Barfield had a very strained marriage himself. His wife Maud was much older than him when they got married. I think 13 years older. So while they had some things in common, especially a love for dance and drama, he also said once that her aversion to anthroposophy was a sword through the marriage knot, which is a kind of devastating image. And they did get married in 1923 when Barfield was he would have been 25 and she would have been 38. But to compound that age gap, he almost immediately joined the anthroposophy movement. And Maud just hated it and called his friends like a glorious company of fools. She liked C.S. Lewis because he wasn't an anthroposophist. He was like Barfield's normal friend, so not a recipe for marital bliss. And then in his friendships too, there was strain, often because of his anthroposophy again. With Lewis's conversion, Barfield said that there was a distance that emerged. He told a story once how late at night after a walking tour that they'd taken together, they were alone and Barfield tried to resurrect their great war to see if Lewis's conversion had changed things for him. But he says Lewis got very emotional, very upset, and refused to talk about it and just said, "I can't bear it." And Barfield commented later that he had the feeling something was broken in their friendship after that. So Barfield knew about that pain that we can feel even in close relationships with friends and family, and how we can feel worlds apart, which is the title of that 1963 book. And I think about how in our time, right, when people's political identity often seems more important to them or more intimate than their religious affiliation, this really resonates, perhaps. I wonder what Barfield would say about those memes that circulate every Thanksgiving, for instance. That just assume there's a dread we all have about family dinners, because who knows what that crazy uncle is going to say. So I think that image of having gaps, of being worlds apart, even in our closest, most intimate connections, is definitely continues on in this book. But you also asked about saving the appearances. I think, Eager Spring extends some of what Barfield writes there, for sure. But I think, as I was saying earlier, his philosophy can be so abstract. He doesn't give a lot of examples or applications. So part of the value of a story like Eager Spring is that it makes his ideas so much more concrete. Barfield wrote 3 texts that are often called the Bergian trilogy, and they're treated as novels, although I think calling them novels is pushing the definition of a novel pretty far, because he's only interested in characterization to the tiniest degree, and plot not at all. So those 3 novels are Worlds Apart, An Ancestral Voice, and This Ever Diverse Pair, which is the lawyer book. So maybe you'd be interested in that one. But in those, I think of them as quasi novels at best. So in those 3, and then in philosophical works like Saving the Appearances, he consistently does argue that it's going to be the imagination that leads us towards final participation. And so I think Eager Spring bears that out and then shows in a very concrete way what that's going to look like through the form of Vi's fairy tale. Yeah.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end. Is there anything we've discussed that you'd like to add to or that we've overlooked?
I guess maybe I would say that Barfield talks in poetic diction about an important idea, and it would be good to be conscious of, just if anyone listening is interested in checking out Barfield's text, maybe Eager Spring, maybe something else. If you want to dive into his writings, he calls it unthinking. And he says it's important. So of course we need thinking, but we also need the shadow or the underside of that, unthinking. So this image of stripping away, trying to come to a text or to the world or to each other in our relationships with each other, aware of our perspective and aware of the biases we bring, but also with this kind of conscious attempt of our will to shed some of those assumptions that have accumulated in us. And I always find that reading Barfield requires both thinking and unthinking because like he just doesn't make sense unless you can unthink some of our materialist assumptions, for instance, that have accumulated in the last several hundred years and that just form the backdrop to everything we think, right? So only in unthinking do any of us have a chance of getting away from that positivist framework that exerts so much control on our minds. Barfield always calls it RUP, residue of unresolved positivism, by which he means like scientific materialism, that kind of framework that creates an unbridgeable gulf between the subjective mental experience we're having and then that objective world outside, that world of nature. And so that mental habit of taking for granted, like that our own spirit is detached from the spirit of nature. And again, to return to that idea of how the study of language, of attending closely to words, is going to be the best starting point for any of us if we want to work on abandoning materialism. And so language is the bridge, Barfield says, that connects our outer and inner worlds. And this feels more and more important to me as time goes on, maybe especially because we're all dealing with this world in which we're having our machines write our words for us, right? And when Barfield talks about the imagination, he's talking about words that come from that creative act of the poetic imagination. Our machines are never going to be able to do that. So it's going to be poetic language that speaks in symbols and metaphor and comes out of that kind of mythic mind. So reading Barfield always makes me kind of return to reading and the study of language and the enjoyment of poetry and feeling kind of validated in my conviction, like, yes, this matters. This has to be the way forward.
Yes, I agree, and I am so grateful for your time today.
Thank you
Thanks
for
again.
having me. It was a real pleasure to talk, Derek.
Thank you. Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word biodiversity. Biodiversity. Biodiversity is a reference to the variety of life on Earth, including all living things and their interactions. It encompasses the variety of genes, species, ecosystems, and the functions they perform. In this very interconnected world, biodiversity is essential for life on Earth. Biodiversity helps ecosystems cope with change. It supports human health and well-being. It helps regulate disease and provides resilience to stress. You see, there's a symphony going on, and biodiversity encompasses every aspect of the concert, from winds to strings to percussion to brass. All the many sounds that come together are a great example of what biodiversity is on our planet. And it's a newer word, so something a little different for The Plunge. Biodiversity wanted to sponsor this episode, given that we talked about Barfield's work, Eager Spring, and of course the incredible importance of cultivating and caring for creation. Biodiversity, according to my friends at AI via Google, known as Gemini, it was coined in the mid-1980s by Walter G. Rosen and popularized by E.O. Wilson. Yeah, so Walter G. Rosen, E.O. Wilson came together at some point, or, you know, E.O. picked it up from Walter. Either way, it gained prominence in the mid-1980s, coinciding with a symposium in 1986 and the publication of an influential book known as Biodiversity. There you have it. So I'm thankful to you, Walter and EO, for bringing us the term biodiversity to help us comprehend the magnitude of the importance for the many strata of life that is bursting across this planet of ours. And I'm Grateful to biodiversity for helping bring me to this point in life, to my own existence, and to yours as well. So appreciate your biodiversity wherever you might find yourself on this planet, and take care now. Look out for one another, and look out for the plants and the creatures, the streams, the mountains, all that stuff. It's all good, it's all beautiful, and it's all for us. So thank you, Biodiversity, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.